Here is yet another YouTube about a Larson family member. I don't know why I keep doing this. I keep thinking some other member of the clan will be interested in the family history too. This video is about my Uncle Bill. To give you some background, my grandmother, Frances Howarth Rudd Larson of Liverpool, England, had 4 boys. 2 by George Rudd of Dublin, Ireland, Arthur and William, and 2 by Herman Larson of Norway. Albert, my father, and Herman. George Rudd and Frances emigrated to Philadelphia before the turn of the century, where George Rudd died a few years later. Frances moved to Chicago with the 2 Rudd boys and married Herman Larson. In Chicago, Frances was associated with the pioneer social worker Jane Addams of Hull House. Jane Addams attended the wedding of my grandmother. Arthur Rudd took his stepfather's name, Larson, but Bill did not. If anyone is interested in more information on the Larson clan, you can go to YouTube and search William Larson's 1928 family film. This current video is about my Uncle Bill, who I'm named after. Uncle Bill died when I was 13. If he had lived longer, I'm sure I would have tried to find out more about his life with Insull. Bill and Teen didn't have any kids, so that part of the history is shut off. But my cousin Marie, Arthur's daughter, who was 12 years older than me, told me she remembered an article about Bill Rudd in the Chicago Tribune in the early 30s that said that Bill Rudd was a protege of Samuel Insull, which rings true from all the other family tales I've heard in my youth. This video starts with a section of a Larson documentary that I did in 1992. Then goes to a PBS documentary of Insull. Then to rare home movies of Insull taken in the 30s by my Uncle Bill at a golf course somewhere around Chicago. And then to some home movies of the Rudd family at their home in Oak Park, Illinois. It ends with some pioneering 1930s 16mm color film that my Uncle Bill did of my Aunt Teen's niece at the Oak Park house.
1923 was a good year for pictures, and here's a picture of Uncle Bill Rudd. Uncle Bill was the most financially successful of the 4 brothers. His entire working career was with the People's Gas, Light, and Coke Company, which is the gas utility in Chicago. At his death in 1943, he was the executive vice president. He was also associated with Samuel Insull, who was the person who was instrumental in making Chicago one of the largest industrial cities in the world. I recently read the book Insull by Forrest MacDonald, who tells of his amazing business career. Insull was Thomas Edison's private secretary and went on to create the electric utilities in northern Illinois, and also was president of People's Gas. During the Depression in 1932, his dynasty fell apart and he was indicted for fraud and embezzlement. He was acquitted on all counts. He died in Paris in 1938. This is a portrait of Bill and Teen taken in 1937, shortly after they visited Insull in France. Uncle Bill's
In the Depression, not all business giants fared as well as A.P. Giannini. In 1932, Samuel Insull's business empire, once worth $226 million, collapsed. It was the single largest business failure ever, and would remain so for the next 70 years. By the summer of 1934, the former magnate was living in a Chicago hotel room, awaiting trial on charges of fraud. Many Americans had lost money in the debacle, and some were out for blood. Dear Sir, this is the last letter. I got 15 sticks of dynamite ready, and 2 guns and 2 revolvers. This is our money, not yours. That summer, Insull started a memoir. The outcome of his trial and his freedom would soon hang on that story. A story of ambition, reinvention, and a boat bound for the United States. The year was 1881. The 21-year-old Englishman had been offered a position in New York as Thomas Edison's private secretary. For months, he'd been carefully maneuvering toward the job, while working for the inventor's business agent in London. I was desperately seasick on the trip, Insull recalled in his memoir, and arrived in New York on Monday evening, February 28th. Immediately I was taken to meet Mr. Edison for the first time. The picture of him is as vivid to me now as if the incident occurred yesterday.
Insull arrives, he's exhausted, he's travelling on the boat, he's still been seasick, and he stands there kind of wobbly. And Edison says, "My God, he's so young." Furthermore, he can barely understand what his Cockney is saying to him. He has a kind of Strotty accent, "Mr. Edison, I've come all this way to help." He doesn't speak the Queen's English. Edison, who's deaf anyway, has a hell of a job understanding him. However, Edison has a need, and immediately Insull is given an astonishing challenge.
That night, Edison laid out his vision for his latest ambition. He'd introduced his incandescent bulb to the world just 2 years earlier. Now, he planned to build in downtown Manhattan the first operating electric power plant. But he was short $150,000 in financing. He challenged Insull to find a way to raise the money. Insull stayed up all night, going through the books. By dawn, he had a plan to modify some contracts and make small changes to licensing rights in Europe.
Insull finds him the money. And Insull then becomes everything to Edison. He carries his bag, gives him his umbrella, checks his appointments, raises money for him, goes and starts a factory in Schenectady. And the young Englishman, given this opportunity, just blossoms.
Born in London to a struggling lower middle class family, Insull always had big ambitions in business, but not much of a chance.
He's brought up in a society where opportunities for people like him who speak like this are very limited. Insull is a brilliant young man. If he'd stayed in England, he might have got to be the manager of a minor bank. But in America, he becomes one of the biggest tycoons there is.
In 1886, Edison gave Insull a chance to run an electrical factory in Schenectady. "Do it big, Sammy," said Edison. "Make it a big success or a big failure. Make it go." He did. It was an acorn from which the giant General Electric would grow. Insull shared many of Edison's dreams, but one would become a quest. At a time when few had electricity, Insull foresaw a wired future for all.
Insull has the idea, sort of a democratic idea, of providing what he believed as a great new technology, a great new source of energy, a great improvement in the quality of life. He really wanted to provide that to everyone.
Insull worked for Edison for 11 years. In 1892, when a company merger pushed the inventor out, Insull left as well, moving to Chicago. He took over a little power station, one of about 20 selling electricity. Combined, they served just 5,000 customers in a city of 1 million. The industry operated on a small scale to contain the risk in this strange new business.
The business of electric power supply is different from any other manufacturing industry because the product is manufactured, transported, distributed, and consumed all in the same instant. You can't store the product. If you're a manufacturer of widgets and there's a market, well, if you get too many of them, you stop making widgets for a while until the market picks up. Electricity, you can't do that. When Insull got into the business, nobody had the foggiest idea what made it work.
Insull's competition played it safe. Their strategy was to sell electricity to those able to pay top dollar, make it a luxury. Insull's answer was the opposite. Make it big, Sammy, Edison had said. To do that, Insull would have to risk everything. First, he mortgaged his future, personally borrowing $250,000 to invest in his little utility. Then he started to eliminate the competition, buying them out one by one. He'd concluded that his utility would run most efficiently as a monopoly. But most important of all, to cut the unit cost of production, he built big. In 1894, he built the largest power plant in the world, the Harrison Street Station. He'd hold the record for the biggest power plant for almost 40 years, pushing the existing technology to its limit, and then beyond.
The first time Insull asked for a 5,000 kilowatt generator, General Electric won't make it. Nobody wants to make it. He finally bullies them into making it, and they're terrified to turn it on. And in fact, they turn it on and it stops.
Insull's chief engineer was standing there, and he looked and he saw Insull standing there with him, and he said, "Mr. Insull, you've got to get out of here. This thing could blow up." And Insull said, "If it blows up, I'll blow up with it."
The massive turbine worked. But giant power plants were just part of Insull's solution. He'd go broke if he could not lower his costs by running the generators around the clock. So Insull sold electricity like a man possessed. charging different prices to customers who used power at different times.
The main way he tried to manage the load initially was in the city by finding customers who would use electricity at times other than the peak period, which was basically from 6 o'clock in the evening till about 10 o'clock in the evening. Like all-night restaurants, all-night drugstores, ice companies that could make the ice at night. He gave them a price they couldn't refuse. Housewives used electricity not during the rush hours, but sort of in the middle of the day, right? For ironing, for vacuuming their homes, eventually for refrigerators.
Insull pushed appliances, gave away electric irons, wired houses on easy terms, anything to build demand. The price of electricity, once so high only the rich could afford it, began to drop. The more users Insull gained, the more he could afford to cut rates. Insull's bold strategy of building big had initiated a cycle of growth and ever cheaper electricity that would continue until the 1960s.
Every time you get a rate cut, he's a hero. As all of us utility users are, rates go down, that's good. They start going up, it's bad. But throughout his entire career, rates went down, and quite dramatically.
Just as Edison invented the light bulb, Insull invented the electric utility. The miracle of cheap electricity spread rapidly in Chicago, as did Insull's ideas around the nation. While rural areas would have to wait decades to get wired, American cities became beacons to the future.
This is a business development with profound social and political and cultural implications for not only how we interact and how our days unfold, but also who we know, what we do, where we go, how hard we work, how we think about ourselves.
From 1907 through to the end of the 20s, Insull ran an ever-expanding empire. His utilities served more than 4 million customers, spread over 32 states, and were valued at nearly $3 billion.
Sam Insull was virtually the Babe Ruth of business in the 1920s. And businessmen were heroes in the 1920s. And so he's a hero among heroes.
To pay for all the expansion, Insull had invented a new way to raise money. Instead of relying on the big banks, he sold low-price bonds and stock to his customers. Over 1 million Americans bought in.
Very few middle-class people were stockholders in that day, but this seemed like a no-lose, win-win situation. Everyone uses electricity, become a stockholder, and you will, in a sense, profit from your own use of energy. How could you lose?
That formula was put to the test when the 20s ended in economic collapse. The Babe Ruth of business stepped up to the plate. Insull personally paid the wages of policemen, teachers, and firemen in bankrupt Chicago. While others retrenched, he kept expanding, believing that if everyone did the same, the Depression would end.
Insull believes he can kind of save America. He's handing out free food. He's buying shares to try and single-handedly kind of hold the price of his stock up. Of course, he can't do that. No one could in the Great Depression.
Trying to save America, Insull overextended himself. The finances of his companies spun out of his control. Creditors took over. During a single day, June 6, 1932, Insull was forced to resign from all the companies he'd amassed over decades. He owed $16 million more than he was worth. Too broke to be bankrupt, one banker said. But the spectacular collapse didn't affect him alone. The The million investors who had placed their faith in him saw their savings melt away. Their admiration turned to anger.
There were hundreds of thousands of stockholders who lost their shirts. He just became an extremely popular target for that reason. He'd been such a hero, been so lionized. He's the cause of all this greatness that we've got in our 20s. Pow! He's also the cause of all this mess that we've got in the 30s.
The press and the politicians piled on. A Chicago prosecutor charged Insull with deceiving investors with false financial statements. He fled the country, but 19 months later was on a boat back to the U.S. By the time he reached Chicago, he'd steeled himself for a fight.
I did everything I could to save the investors in my companies. The depression was too much for me. I went down with my ship. You will be convinced that although my judgment was bad, I was not dishonest.
Insull waited 5 months in a Chicago hotel room for his trial to begin. That day arrived October 2nd, 1934.
The prosecution's case was built upon a bookie proposition. They claimed that Insull had used the mails to defraud by overstating the earnings of his companies. The defense, on the contrary, was that number one, we followed standard accounting practices, and number two, let's put Samuel Insull on trial for his whole life. So Insull got on the stand, and Judge Thompson, who was his lawyer, led him through telling his story, step by step, starting with the semi-poverty in London and moving on up. And he just sat there and over the course of several days just hypnotized the jury. The jury went out in 2 minutes, said he's perfectly innocent.
Fearing their quick decision would suggest they'd been bribed, the jurors waited 2 hours to issue their verdict. Not guilty on all counts. Insull's actions had been found within the law, but the verdict didn't change the record-breaking loss paid for by many Americans. He would remain the Depression's scapegoat. With his reputation destroyed, Insull left the country. A few years later, he was found dead of a heart attack in the Paris subway. Though largely forgotten, his legacy remains.
Insull says that electricity shouldn't just be for the rich. The masses will deserve electricity, and I will see they can get it very cheaply. Insull's genius, nothing short of that, is to find a way to get it out to society so that the benefits of it can be universally shared.